So today I'm going to talk about the cause of suffering, one of the causes, the cessation of suffering, and then specifically the role of meditation in that cessation. And this is going to be a little bit of an extension of Bancho's talk from last Sunday. And for those that weren't here for that, Bancho, my memory was, talked about the three marks of existence and the Four Noble Truths. And I started off this talk with the question of why do we sit? Why do we come and do meditation? Why do we sit quietly in a room with a bunch of other people on Sunday when we could be watching TV or doing all the other things that we partly think are going to actually provide us with satisfaction and relief from suffering? And the reason that I came to practice, and it seems from talking to people, getting to know the community over the years, is that it hurts. Being alive oftentimes hurts. There's some fundamental dissatisfaction or dis-ease in our lives, and all the things that we've tried to do to make that go away has just been symptomatic palliative care for a disease that is far deeper. And that's actually the terminology or the language that the Buddha uses in the Four Noble Truths. It's the same formula that at the time Indian medicine used to diagnose, describe, and then lay out the treatment for diseases like, cancer or heart disease or things like that. So it's using the same terminology. And in Buddhism, we say that the core, the root cause of suffering is ignorance. And the term for that is avidya. And avidya means without seeing. So it's also the origin, the original term. It's where we get the word like video. It's the same Proto-Indo-European root there. So it's without knowing. It's also, you can think of the word ignorance as itself not knowing or not seeing, not being familiar with. And from that ignorance arises desire and aversion. So from the perspective of a separate self or of simply I, from that comes the whole cycle of birth and death. Comes gain and loss, becomes life and death. And there's a very good visualization of this truth, which is the wheel of life. And I think we have, I don't know if we have it on public display in the office still. Yes. So it shows this very large figure, which represents impermanence, holding this big wheel. And there's a couple things around him. There's the Buddha pointing to the moon. And then holding this giant wheel is made up of a couple different parts. And the very center of the wheel is ignorance, or the three poisons. And ignorance is depicted as a pig, which in traditional Buddhist thought was the most ignorant of the animals. And then there's also a bird and a snake. And the bird represents attachment, because apparently it's a particular type of bird. That bird in India is known for having monogamous relationships, so it's very attached to its partner. So that's the metaphor that's used for attachment. And then a snake represents aversion, because snakes are cagey and rear up and bite at you. And so those three poisons, ignorance, the pig, aversion, the snake, and attachment, the bird, are at the very center of that wheel. And we can think of ignorance, of not knowing, as being the kind of spark plug that sets the whole engine going. And it's depicted in a couple different ways. Sometimes the bird and the snake are coming out of the mouth of the pig, and sometimes the pig is holding the tails of the bird and the snake, or sometimes the bird and the snake are holding the pig's tail, or sometimes they're all holding each other's tail, And it all basically gets at the kind of center churning mechanism of the daily suffering that we all experience and are all very familiar with. And then on the edge of the wheel are the 12 nidanas, which are also just called the causes. It's more often translated in Buddhism as the 12 links of dependent origination. So nidana means ni is down or into, and da is to bind into or to fasten. So these are the kind of the fastenings, the that which connects and then links the whole endless cycle of birth and death of samsara that we talk about. And we can talk about that as being moment to moment. So it's just the moment to moment. There's this thing and then this thing and this thing, and I want this and I don't want that, and it's just that constant churning of life. And we can also talk about that as lifetime to lifetime as well. And the first step in that 12-link chain is ignorance. So again, that's the first beginning, the spark that then leads to the whole spiel, the whole carnival or nightmare, or wherever you want to view it. And again, this is a object that's made so that you can, if you're not literate, or you don't know about the way that, you don't know about the teachings of Buddhism, these scrolls would often be put up in front of monasteries, kind of like in Catholic churches where you'd have teachings from the Bible in stained glass in the church, so that people that couldn't read Latin could have some sort of memory of and connection to the teachings of Christ. This is similarly, it's a way to kind of condense the whole mechanism of suffering into an iconographic image that you can learn and then be reminded of. So that first link is depicted as a person, a blind person with a cane, wandering around. And we can see that in our own lives as wandering through our life, unsure of the true reality of how things are. And then that ignorance or that blindness is what then brings about anger and hatred and striving after things that we think are going to make us happy, and then being upset when the things that we think are happy or making us happy go away, and the whole deal again. And so then the question is, well, what is it that we're ignorant of? It comes out in a couple of different ways. Traditionally, it's the Four Noble Truths, which Bancho talked about last week, which is basically just the origin of suffering. We're ignorant about how is it that suffering comes about. But it can also mean specifically ignorant about the three marks of existence, which again, to summarize, are the three qualities of all that arises. Everything that's conditioned, anything that arises and passes away, is marked by one of three qualities, or rather marked by all three of these qualities. Impermanence, it changes. Our bodies change, the sky changes, our thoughts change. And these are very easy qualities to notice in our daily life. And even right now, we can notice that the ways our body felt when we first sat down, or the ways that our body felt when we first came into the room, are very different than they are now. And that as we sit here longer, pain or very slight irritation or discomfort will arise. It's a very easy way to come to know that impermanence. Or we can see on these little larger grand scales that politics change and history changes, and sometimes one nation is doing better than the other nation. Or our relationships change. or all the ways that everything is constantly in motion. And the traditional word is anicca, which means without permanence. And it contrasts nirvana, which is permanent, or that which is unchanging. And the second mark, the second quality of conditioned phenomena is suffering. And Bancho talked a little bit last week about how that word gets translated or mistranslated a lot. There's a 19th century Anglophonic interpretation of a word from a culture on the other side of the world. And there is truth to that, and that obviously in all of our lives we've encountered gross, large-scale suffering with a capital S, but this is talking more broadly about the constant underlying quality of dis-ease. The word, I'm going through all these etymologies because I find them very helpful for me to be able to latch on to the granularity of the term, and I hope that that's also helpful for you. But the do of dukkha is just difficult or bad, and then the ka is the axle hole of a wheel. So the very center where the axle goes through. Something's off about the wheel, and we often talk about that here as being the one wheel in the shopping cart that's off, and that as you're trying to move through the shopping center, it just keeps kind of flapping. But it can also, and this is I think another interesting translation that I haven't heard before, is the same do means difficult or bad, but it can also, from the Sanskrit sta, just mean standing or abiding. So you have a bad footing or a bad standing in the world, like you're on kind of uneven ground, or you're on inclined ground. You don't quite have that good rootedness into the earth. So there's impermanence, anicca, suffering, dukkha, and the final one is anatta, or translated from the Sanskrit, an-atman. So there's no, if you're familiar with the concept of the Atman, which again is also translated in different ways. It's often translated as soul, because that's the concept in the Western world that we are familiar with as this kind of seed at the very center that's permanent and fixed. But even that's not quite right. There is a sense of self with a capital S that is permanent and that is unchanging. And Buddhism, in contrast, says that there's not this fixed Atman, this fixed Atta that is this immortal quality, this immortal kind of spark. And we can see that in our lives as well in lots of different ways. That when we sit and we're asked to find this self, we ask these questions like, who is it that is suffering? Who is it that is hearing? Who is it that is dragging this corpse around, is a very traditional way of putting it. And we can't find that. We can't find that one thing, that one point. We can find a constellation of causes and conditions, a constellation of phenomena. That not finding is pointing to that anatta, that there's not a little person inside pulling the wheel. So those three marks, impermanence, suffering, and no self, are what we are ignorant of. And as long as we're ignorant of those qualities, then samsara continues. And without being able to see those qualities, we're just stuck. And in moments of our lives when we find ourselves stuck in suffering, the cause again is that lack of knowing, or our inability to see that this anger is impermanent, that there is suffering in that anger, and that there is no fixed self on the inside that I'm actually protecting. That I set up all these boundaries and walls to try to protect this thing that I think exists, but actually is really just a dream. So then, how do we come to know these three marks better? Like, how do we actually, if the cause of suffering is being ignorant of these three qualities of being, then how do we come to not be ignorant? How do we come to see these qualities? And the fact that you are here, or the fact that you are online watching this, partly means that you know these qualities already. That most people already know that there is dukkha. They've encountered dissatisfaction or dis-ease or pain or hurt, or all the other things in our lives that are hard. And we're probably also familiar with impermanence. If everyone here is an adult, we can look back in our lives and see that things have changed. That who we were 7 years ago is probably not who we are today. And that relationships that have meant something to us, or family members, have died or left or ended. And these are often the things that bring us to practice. The death of a loved one, anxiety and depression, where oftentimes people come to practice because of peak experiences, or peak experiences brought about by hallucinogenics. There's some taste of the fact that there is no self. We've tasted into that mark of existence, or that quality of being. And that with that knowing, that partial knowing, we are drawn to practice like a dog that can smell something in the distance. That we can't quite see it, maybe, or we've tasted it, but we know that there may be something beyond the horizon that we can come to know far more deeply. And so our intention with practice is to both broaden our understanding of these three marks and also deepen them, because there's very gross suffering, large-scale suffering, but there's also very, very subtle disease. And that very subtle dis-ease, is more present than we may think that it is. Or the subtlety of impermanence is more than just our body changes on a level of, it's different than it was 20 years ago. It changes on a granularity of scale that is very, very fine and very, very fast. And the same thing is true for the quality of self. We come to see more and more that identity of me is present in fewer and fewer qualities of our lives, if that makes sense. The way I envision it is like we're this map. Well, if that's not me, well, this is me. But then that's not me either. So we kind of draw in the boundaries until there's not really anywhere left to stand on that sense of self. And then we can broaden it in all the different ways that it shows up, all the different ways that impermanence shows up in our life, all the different ways that dis-ease is present in our life, and all the different ways that non-self is present in our lives. And the way that we broaden and deepen that, one of the ways is meditation. And so in that fourth noble truth of the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha says, okay, so there's suffering, there's a cause of suffering, there's a cessation of suffering, and the cessation of suffering is the Eightfold Path, which are all these different ways to be in the world. You can break that up into three basic categories. One is virtue, or sila. This is the precepts. This is about how to be in the world, like right livelihood. You can also break it up into mind, the second category. So it's also translated as samadhi or meditation. And then the third they're called the trainings. The third training is wisdom or prajna, so knowing the truth. So those 8 can be condensed into 3. And specifically that mind, the samadhi, the meditation part, is what I want to talk a little bit more about. And it's part of why we're here, and I think especially as Zen practitioners, in a tradition that puts so much emphasis on meditation, I think it's worth looking at how that helps bring about knowing of these 3 qualities. And so we start with concentration, because if the mind is always spinning off in different directions, if we're led around like a bull by the nose, or another analogy that we often use is by like the monkey that swings from tree to tree, that monkey mind. If that's untrained, then like a microscope in the back of a truck that's bouncing around, it's really hard to actually focus in and see anything. It's hard to see the granularity, it's hard to see the depth, and it's hard to be able to actually notice the omnipresence of these 3 qualities if we're always just swinging from one thing to another. And it's especially difficult these days because we live in an environment where our attention is actively bought and sold. That all of the advertising and the social media that we engage in, all that basically comes down to, we're going to give you something that is tantalizing, that will give you a little dopamine drip, and in exchange, we're going to get your attention to pay attention to advertising. And whoever can pay the highest bid will get your attention the longest or the most frequent. And because there's always competing factors, there's this constant switching between, well, no, pay attention to this, no, pay attention to this, well, what about this, well, what about this? And so we're undoing that constant channel surfing, or that constant jumping between the habit of mind that is unsettled and the habit of mind too that's seeking really intense experiences. So I think about like the Dorito flavor blasted. We want a Dorito flavor blasted life, the intense, everything to 11. And so when we sit, we learn how to focus. When we concentrate on concentration, we learn how to focus. We learn how to continually bring the mind back. And in that training, we learn how to abide continuously. We also learn how to be satisfied with increasingly subtler sensations or increasingly subtler stimuli. So instead of needing, bungee jumping or 60-second or 6-second TikTok videos, we can be really genuinely satisfied by just the breath. It takes a bit of faith or determination to be able to see through those early stages when that's not satisfying. But even the slightest disentanglement from that wheel, I think, is enough to get us to continue to come back. And so as we deepen through concentration and we come to be satisfied by more and more just being, we also come to see that that's not quite enough. So that's when we bring in vipassana, which is insight meditation. And so here we practice shamatha vipassana, so simultaneous insight and concentration. And historically, this is the same process that the Buddha experienced. So before the Buddha's enlightenment, the Buddha goes to all these teachers and he learns about deeper forms of concentration, increasingly deep forms of concentration. But even at the deepest form of concentration, the Buddha knew that there was something that wasn't quite right, that still wasn't satisfying. And so then we turn to insight meditation to see into the qualities of these phenomena. the qualities of our lives and to see more clearly, again, these three marks of existence, which requires the ability to stay concentrated on our breath, which then we can use to stay concentrated on impermanence. We can notice that our body is changing. We can notice the static-like buzzing, humming of the body, the kind of field of sensation that we call the body. And that, resting in that, we see that it's not just this one thing. And then that's not just a rational understanding, it's something that we can come to really know. I think it's really helpful that French has two words for knowing. There is the knowing that you have intellectual knowing, and there's also the knowing, other Romance languages as well, but there's the knowing of familiarity. And I think that's that second knowing of familiarity that we're trying to encourage and cultivate here. So it's the familiarity with the body as a field of constant change. And we can come to see too that that's just itself an image. When we close our eyes and I ask you, how do you know that you have a body? What evidence do we have? There is sensation, but we also notice that on top of that field of sensation is just this image of a body. And that when we can taste insights like that, that frees up a lot of the suffering in our lives. And that requires the ability to really stay with very subtle or very, not hidden, but so obvious, so close that you can't even realize it, truths. But then, beyond just all of these insights that I can put words to and that I can describe, that you can lay out on a list and describe with words, that meditation practice is what leads to the turning that goes beyond words, and which our ancestors use poetic language to describe. The awakening to reality that is not conceptual, and that cuts that link, those links of samsara, right at the root. And it goes straight to seeing things as they are in a way that I can't put words to. But requires meditation or concentration in order to actually experience and see. And that if you look at the enlightenment stories of the ancestors, present in all of them is an extended period of years and years of concentration. So we have these stories in Zen of enlightenment experiences in koans. And it's always a pebble hitting a bucket, or a door being closed on your foot, or some kind of instant cracking. That is the kind of period at the end of a sentence of many, many years of concentration practice. And if you look at awakening experiences in our own lives, or awakening experiences of teachers that didn't necessarily practice meditation, like I often think about this story. We have a teacher that we talk about in our Sangha quite a bit, and we just recently did a retreat on Byron Katie. Her experience of being profoundly, deeply depressed, to the point that she was essentially lying on the floor when a cockroach crawled across her and she had her awakening. Knowing from personal experience, that is the samadhi of depression, that the being so profoundly sunk into, in my experience, is a samadhi, is a concentration in which we are not thinking about. It is not a depression in which we are thinking about, woe is me. It is so profoundly enrapturing that there is that similar quality of concentration. So I'll encourage myself, and I'll encourage everyone else to, over the next week, really make it a practice of noticing qualities of impermanence, qualities of disease, and qualities of non-self in your day, in my day. To really actively cultivate the intention of attention to changing, unsatisfying, no fixed self qualities of being. And that from my own experience, that leads to immense ease and joy. That leads to a familiarity with reality and with ourselves in a way that is unconditionally satisfying and unconditionally joyful.